Let's take a look at the offense to get started with the 53-man roster. Logan, they decided to keep three quarterbacks, Jaden Daniels, Marcus Mariota, and Jeff Driscoll does do enough to make it. I also wonder how much this has to do with Mariota, the groin injury. They've said he's going to be fine and good to go and back up. He was out practicing yesterday, wearing number 18, by the way, the great number switch of roster cut day. Mikey Sanders still goes down to number 0. Mariota takes 18. De'Ami Brown winds up keeping 2 for those that are keeping track. I think it's an interesting choice, but I also loved what Dan Quinn said about this, which is basically, I liked the room. And I think a big part of this, honestly, based off that quote, this is me extrapolating like a sports talk radio host should, but is saying, like, we don't want to change the environment that Jaden Daniels is essentially being raised in the NFL is. If Jaden is thriving with having Mariota and Driscoll and this group of coaches and Sam Hartman, who they bring back on the practice squad, let's make sure that room stays exactly like it is and see if that growth continues at the fantastic rate it has so far.
Yeah, and I think it's to me it's probably more injury related, because I think you could have kept him around on the practice squad. I think you could have kept Sam Hartman around on the practice squad also. But I think that's a great point. I think you want to keep an ecosystem around the young quarterback that allows him to grow and develop and feel comfortable. And so obviously Mariota has been highly touted for that. Even Sam Hartman's been touted for that. And I do think Driscoll played well enough. And if the injury is an issue, I think it's nice having a security blanket. And I think seeing him move around and seeing him do some stuff, I'm not saying they're going to, change the offense, but I think he could be very successful in an offense that's analogous to what they did in Philly, like with the zone reads and the quarterback runs, because he's a bigger body guy, kind of built like Jalen Hurts. So I do think there are some advantages to keeping him around in the building, and I think he could be very successful in this offense if he had to play. So I like that they did it. I think it probably feels more injury related, but I do think he played well, and I think you saw the athlete and you saw the physicality that he plays the position with. So I think this is a great move.
Yeah, no, I totally get it, and it's not like I look anywhere else in particular and be like, oh my God, they're so short at X position. Linebacker, yeah. I guess we'll get there, but there's some kind of asterisk caveats to the linebacker position that we'll get to as well. The running back position was one that played out exactly like I think we thought it would by the end, which is Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler, and Jeremy McNichols. They also, on the practice squad, bring back Chris Rodriguez, which I like a lot, and then Michael Wiley as well, Logan. What do you make of what they did at that running back position?
Well, I think it's kind of the thing you just talked about, like with doing what's best for the team, doing what's best for the quarterback's development. Like obviously, Austin and B-Rob are going to be the guys, but I think having that veteran experience in the backfield as a pass protector and a guy who's been around the league and been through some tough times and been with some different teams and knows offense and, I think is willing to like run hard and get some tough yards for you and is a special teams guy is the right move. I don't think you want your backup third down running back to be a rookie. I don't think you want that as much as Wiley did in the preseason to kind of say, oh, look at him run, look at him catch the football. I don't think he was ready to surpass Nichols in this example. And I think it's great because you get to keep him on practice squad, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it's also nice having Chris Rodriguez in the fold there because I do think, I honestly didn't think they saw the value of him. But I think after seeing them keep him, seeing them keep Wiley, it's like they kept 2 backups for both spots. They're kind of their big back and their pass catching back. And I think that's the other thing about McNichols that's interesting is I think he fills both of those roles on game day if in a pinch if you had to because of an injury. But having 2 guys on the practice squad that could elevate into one of those roles respectively, I think is probably pretty advantageous. So I think I like the room. I like they're able to keep some young talented pieces around. And again, I think it's more reflective of their confidence in the experience of McNichols to come in and do both things. Because it's interesting on the depth chart they're listed as 2 different positions almost. It's like running back 1 and running back 2 on some depth charts that you see. So I think they view them that way, and I think they're different skill sets. So I think it's good to have a guy that can do both on the 53, and then 2 guys on practice squad who could do one of each.
Yeah, it's worth noting at this point that they can, if they want to on a game day, call Rodriguez or Wiley up. So if they know, for instance, that they're going to go super run heavy on a game plan in a given week and they want to have an extra back to spell, they could do that. And both those guys, Wiley and Rodriguez, played some special teams. Chris played it last year. Obviously, Wiley's a rookie, but both did it in the preseason. So that's worth noting that if they were to be called up, like they could be active and useful, and that's great. The other guy that they did keep is Kaz Allen. So despite the kind of lack of playmaking, despite some of the mistakes, I think it was pretty clear they wanted to kind of push forward with the running back, slash roll, experiment. And they are able to do that on practice squad. I'm curious to see if they have any weeks where they call him up and try to use him in that Deebo Samuel role, to use Kliff Kingsbury's term. Again, Kliff did clarify. I'm not saying he's Deebo, but the role of having him being able to line up anywhere. But I also feel like it's not a long-term project, but something that needs to continue to be developed, because it didn't work in the preseason in the limited number of snaps that we saw it.
Yeah, and I think if you look at his college film, obviously I watched him when he was coming out. Like, he does a good job with like space runs, like kind of, they're not like trick runs, but they're like pseudo draws. They're like pin pulls off a zone read. So there's a ton of air. There's a ton of blockers covering you up. And obviously, like, once he finds a crease, he can do some damage, and he did some damage at UCLA. So I think it's interesting because Deebo is big enough that he can kind of do all the stuff that Kyle wants to do. He can run gap scheme. He can run outside zone. I think Kaz Allen's a little bit more specific, obviously. So I think while Kaz needs to show what he can do, I think also understanding what he does well will help kind of accelerate this process. And I think having him on practice squad, I think will be very advantageous to, again, establish what he does well and how best to utilize him in this role, and honestly kind of determine ultimately if he's well suited or suited enough to do it.
I could see a situation where Kaz Allen is elevated in the middle of the year, like full to the 53, and they use him and he's making plays, and that's great. I could also see where after 6 weeks they want to sign someone else and they go, this ain't going well. Like the full realm of possibilities is there, but they do keep Kaz Allen on the practice squad. Tight end Logan. Colson Yankoff made it.
Yeah,
UDFA out of UCLA. He's going to be hosting a podcast with me in 12 years.
Yeah, hopefully, man. I mean, it was really interesting to watch that kind of go down. I think we talked about this a little bit, like how close it was, or could potentially could be, between Cole Turner and Colson Yankoff. Cole, I thought, improved tremendously over the course of the preseason, but I think he did have a couple errors or blemishes or mistakes that probably, in the weighing of this, favor Colston. And then also, I think the other thing is, like, I went back and did a film breakdown for Coach's Show, which is coming out this Saturday, and we did a breakdown of Tyler Owens. So I watched a ton of special teams. And so Tyler Owens is an absolute lunatic on teams, like doing stuff that you've never seen before. But the other guy that does a lot of crazy stuff on teams is Colson Yankoff. And so I think what you're looking at there is you're looking at, again, a little bit of an upside play. And it makes sense for the fourth tight end, right? Because you got your three guys that are going to play a lot. And your fourth tight end is going to be predominantly used on teams, but he's traveling to games, he's on the roster, and I think you saw flashes of what he can do from an athletic standpoint. Because I think people forget, like, he was not a tight end in college; he played running back. So to see him transition from running back to this and start to pick up the nuances of inline blocking, to see the spaces of routes, all that kind of stuff, again, that upside feels like the right thing, because I think he can develop into something special, and I think the special teams scaffolding give him an opportunity to do that, at least in his first maybe 2 years. So I like this move. It makes a lot of sense to me, and obviously I'm bummed for Cole because I think he improved a lot over the course of the preseason, but ultimately, like, if you're going to keep four, that dude better be an absolute lunatic on teams. And I think the other thing is he also feels like a good backup for Ben Sinnott in terms of being able to play fullback, line up as a slot receiver. Right. Obviously, the running back background is really important. So I think, again, it kind of like McNichols, he can back up, the F and the Y in a pinch if he had to. That makes a lot of sense, and the team's value very, very high with him. So very excited for Colson, obviously. Yeah,
my thoughts on where this position might go changed when we talked about his special teams value. And this is the from a prediction standpoint, the one that I'm mad about, that I didn't just pull the trigger and put him on. I kept Turner on. And obviously that wound up being backwards because I was like, Yankoff's definitely going to be on P squad if he gets through waivers, which I figured he would as a UDFA. And instead it was the other way. Cole Turner gets through waivers, and he is around on the practice squad. And I think that's a reward for him for doing it the right way all throughout the offseason. He played like his hair was on fire, but there was just a lack of ultimate production. That try hard has to turn into something, and I think some big mistakes in the games when the lights were brightest probably is what is the separator there. All right, the moment that everyone's been waiting for, Logan. Let's talk about the wide receiver room, and everyone's psyched about this because they make a move after they name the 53, and that is to sign Noah Brown. Of course, the 6 that ultimately make it are Terry McLaurin, De'Ami Brown, Luke McCaffrey, Olamide Zaccheaus, Jameson Crowder, and Byron Pringle, which we kind of thought would be the case. That was actually the prediction that we made on the radio show, was those 6, with Pringle being the guy that just kind of stood out, having done enough, and the veteran savvy and the kick returner and the whole deal. They also keep Mitchell Tinsley and Bryson Tremaine on practice squad, which is interesting. 2 of the guys that are from last year's crop, or Tinsley's case 2 years ago, but guys that have been here that, Tinsley had a really nice game the other night. We've talked about Tremaine quite a bit, but I'm kind of surprised that like there's no Rosemy Jackson and some of the other young guys who played pretty well. And there's just a level of evenness amongst that group. I thought they might lean towards some of the guys they bring in. And then, of course, Noah Brown. Let's talk about Brown separately in a second because I have a specific question for you on him. Yeah. But the 6 that they keep, how does that set up to support Jaden Daniels in year 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think the moving of Jahan showed a vision for the room that they want tough, competitive, smart dudes. And I understand that that's kind of the roster theme, but go down the list, man. Terry, tough, competitive, smart. OZ, tough, competitive, smart. Luke, every single one of those dudes is not afraid to block. They play with tremendous urgency. They are where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be there in route concepts. So to me, it's a very solid group. I know fans are probably like, oh, there's no true 2. We need to get more talented. And I'm not disputing that. But I do think that like when you look at this group, like they will definitely play better than the sum of their parts on paper. Like they are just football players. Like there's a consistency and a toughness to that group that you very rarely see in receiver rooms. And I love that because, again, part of it is like from 2010 to 2012 when Kyle was here, like I played with Josh Morgan, I played with Pierre Garçon, like dudes who would absolutely kill you if they had the opportunity in the run game and the pass game. Like they were absolute savages. So I really appreciate that type of play stylistically because there's going to be 3 of those dudes on the field at one time. Probably they're going to be 11 personnel. And talk about having a cultural identity for your team. You need receivers that are going to be like, the DBs are like, man, I wish I wasn't playing in this game right now. And I think that's what this group gives you. And I also love that they kept the 2 guys on the back end of the roster and practice squad. Bryson Tremaine plays exactly that way. Mitchell Tinsley plays exactly that way. And so it's 7-8 guys that is what they do. And I think, again, I understand there's a lack of talent, but I look at the tight end room with Zach Ertz, and we've talked about this before. Like he's going to get a huge share of targets. So to me, it's Terry, Zach, and then you kind of intermingle like your De'Ami Brown, your OZ, your Luke McCaffrey in the situation that best suits them. And I think you're going to have a pretty solid group here.
Yeah, I thought Adam was really sharp in pointing out yesterday that you don't really improve your team in August. Like you improve your team in March and April. Yeah. And they entered March and April with the idea that Jahan Dotson was going to regain form as a former number 1, or first round draft pick. And it didn't work out. And there's only so much backup planning you can do for that kind of stuff. And so they ultimately made the decision to move on from Jahan based off of what they saw, which is a totally valid decision based off what we saw. And there's just not a lot you can do at that point to try to get a number 2 receiver in because those guys aren't available because they're on teams. That said, Noah Brown might come in and as soon as he can learn the offense and everything, elevate to that. Different body type, different caliber of player than perhaps the production certainly of these other guys. A guy that's had over 500 yards in the last 2 seasons in Dallas and then last year in Houston, averaged 17.2 a catch, 6'2", it's like 220, can run. Different kind of player. And Logan, the question I wanted to ask you more specifically is what kind of challenge does he face to come in at this point of the year? We've talked about this before. When you left Washington, you went to Chicago and it was like time to play because you got cut at the end of camp that year when your time in Burgundy and Gold came to an end and had to learn an offense just in the same way that Noah Brown's going to have to learn this one. what kind of challenge does he face? And then ultimately, once he overcomes that challenge, what does he bring to the team?
Yeah, I think the one thing about the Kliff Kingsbury offense, at least so far, it seems like the guys pick it up really quick. I don't know if there's like not a lot of volume in, or the way he coaches it, or the verbiage makes it easier, but it does seem like, I would imagine, he'd have a relatively easy time picking it up, especially with guys who have been here. They can help bring him along, and I think they're going to be pretty invested in bringing him along. So I don't think it'll be too challenging. Maybe the quickest to be ready week 1. It's nice to have 2 weeks, kind of this pseudo bye week here with no game this weekend. It gives you more time to figure it out and learn it. So I do think he'll be fine. But if it's not this week, it's the following week. And in terms of role, like he's a really interesting guy. I went back and watched his last 5 games from last season, and obviously he didn't play in the last game of the last year because he was hurt. So that's another thing. He's kind of negotiating injury, back and shoulder and all this kind of stuff. But one thing that jumped out to me right away is he plays the way that this receiver room is going to be expected to play. Like, he's very, very physical. He's very urgent in the run game. Love to see that. He's got some suddenness as a route runner. He's got some good vertical speed. He reminds me of like a little bit more polished at the top of your route, De'Ami Brown kind of guy. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's tall, he runs fast. He's not the most consistent at the catch point, which was a little surprising given his body size. Like, he had a couple drops. Everybody's got drops, but just not super consistent at the catch point. So I think there's going to be some developmental stuff there. But can he help your team? Absolutely. He's a good football player. Absolutely. And I think when you compare him to a guy like Bryson Tremaine, I think the athlete is better. The vertical speed, the suddenness is better. And so that's why you probably make that move, is like he's got the size, but he also moves a little bit better for a guy that size. And like you said, he's been very productive. And you watch, I think it was a Cincinnati game last year. I mean, he had like 140 yards receiving or something like that. And again, those are schemed up touches. It's not like he's winning one-on-ones consistently, but you need guys like that in your offense. So to me, maybe Terry's the one. And then again, he kind of falls into, maybe De'Ami's the vertical guy. Maybe he's the comeback guy. Maybe, whatever. And I think you just kind of find a role for him. And I think he's a little bit more nuanced as a route runner, which is nice. It's a skill set that fits the room. It's a personality that seems to fit the room based on play style. So I think it's a nice addition. I just don't, if you're a fan, don't get crazy and carried away to say this is the number 2 guy. I think he's got I think he kind of falls in line with the rest of the guys, like with the OZs. And, OZ had a 600-yard receiving 2 years ago in Philly. Like, that's what he reminds me of, a guy that in the right situation can be very productive for your offense.
Yeah, I think the goal long-term is that he probably becomes the 2, but that could be a more long-term thing. Like, he's not going to step in week 1 and be the 2 for a number of reasons, including that shoulder, which he hasn't played in the preseason. Like, part of the reason he's available is because he was hurt and banged up and couldn't get on the field and prove that he belonged closer to the top of that Texans receiving room, which they obviously revamped in the offseason. So, certainly, I think we're all hoping he can be on the field sooner rather than later. But it could be a couple weeks until he's really playing with a higher snap count. And then we'll see how he fits with Jaden not having the offseason, although Jaden seems to get along pretty quickly with pretty much everybody. But how that ultimately goes. All right, last thing along the offensive line, Logan. No major surprises here. Brandon Coleman, Nick Allegretti, Tyler Biotish, Sam Cosmi, Andrew Wiley, Cornelius Lucas, Trent Scott. I think it was almost, we just didn't know what the injury status was there. So as we made some predictions, or said like, oh, did he make it? But turns out Scott's still there as the 4th tackle. Michael Dieter, and then Chris Paul. And I think Chris Paul is also the kind of interesting one when you talk about Scott, because we thought maybe he had surpassed him on the tackle depth chart, and that made Trent Scott expendable. Julian Good-Jones, the only offensive lineman they wind up keeping on the practice squad, so I think that's interesting as well. They could obviously add and swap some guys out.
Did they not sign Ricky Stromberg? I thought he was on there too. It might have changed.
I do not see Stromberg on the initial release. I can look that up real quick. Okay. But yeah, so what do we make of this offensive line group, where we're worried and where we feel pretty good?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the group we kind of thought it was going to be. You know what I mean? Like, approximately this. I think the Trent Scott thing makes sense because they don't know where Coleman's at, and if you're not sure where Coleman's at, you still need to make sure you've got a swing guy that can do both. And Scott has shown that he can do that. He showed that last year. So I think the main thing is like, where's Coleman at in his development? Will he play week 1? I don't know. I don't know if I'd feel super comfortable throwing a rookie in versus that Todd Bowles defense and how much they pressure. But if you feel like he's ready to go, maybe you're rotating series or doing something like that, or maybe you pick a softer landing point in terms of getting him in there. But I think those tackles, they make a lot of sense. I mean, that's kind of what we thought it was going to be from very early in the offseason. The interior honestly feels kind of the same way. I don't think there's really any surprises there. They go Dieter, even though he didn't blow the doors off preseason. But again, none of those other guys, Ricky Stromberg, Julian Good-Jones, made a push to say that they need to be on the team over him. And I think Chris Paul, I'm happy to see that, because I think early on it looked like he was going to have a difficult time making the roster, but he just kept plugging away. And I think that's a very deserved spot for him. So very happy for him that he's in there.
Yeah, for sure. And Stromberg, not on the practice squad. In fact, he's not currently on anyone's practice squad.
Okay.
A lot of Bears fans are clamoring, saying, "Gotta go get him." Okay, you have fun with that, Chicago. Wish Ricky the best. But yeah, totally. I agree. I think this is a group that potentially could evolve throughout the year. It's one that I expect them to put a lot more resources in next year, and they are just going to have to be cognizant of what they are right now, which is better than I think some people think. I was listening to the NFC East preview on the Athletic Football Show yesterday, and Derek Klassenberg, who I like a lot, just crushed them. They're like, "Oh my God," he's like, "Are they going to be 2023 Giants bad?" And I was like, "There's just no way that is the case."
I will say they're not very deep. The depth is a little bit of a concern. So if there's an injury, maybe they kind of drift in that territory. But I think when you look at, and this is really nerdy stuff, there's the analytics of offensive line play. And last year, obviously, they weren't good. But when you watch down to down, turn on the film, watch it. Yes. And you're watching 5-step drops, down in and down out. So I think I've said this before on the podcast. I remember being in meetings with Kyle, and he's like, "I don't want a 5-step drop more than 5 times in a game." And we were doing it upwards of 35 times last year. You are exposing that group to so much difficulty and challenge. And when I watched them, I was like, they're actually in these reps when the defense knows. That's the other thing. When the defense knows it's a passing down, you're basically giving them all the advantage. And we were doing that every single play. And for them to be as consistent as they were, I was like, oh my gosh, this group is, I know they're much maligned statistically, but they're playing better than the numbers would indicate. And it's kind of interesting, because you go back 2 years, 3 years, and they were the darlings statistically. It was this is one of the best offensive lines in the country, blah 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 blah. But when you watch it down to down, they weren't as good as they appeared. So when you watch the film, I think everyone gets on Wiley as being this he was fine last year. And I think if you are able to deleverage them and go from 35 times to 15 times, which is a much more reasonable number in terms of 5-step drop pass protection, because you're going to have quick game, you're going to have screens. I'm not saying throw the ball 15 times. This group will play better. Statistically, they'll play better. So, again, that's where it comes down to, with them specifically, Kliff and this offensive staff, and saying and I think in the preseason you've seen they've done a really good job. Have we even talked that Chris Paul started a game at right tackle after playing guard for the entire preseason?
Right, protecting Jaden Daniels, by the way, not just Jeff Driscoll.
And we didn't even talk about him. There was no pressure, because we understood the ball needed to get out. We ran the football effectively. It's ridiculous, but you can insulate the offensive line, and you have to. And so I think when you look at the best offenses in the league right now, they have good offensive lines like Detroit, San Francisco, Kansas City, but they insulate that group a ton. They the play callers there are excellent. So I think
so does the quarterback, and that's
yes.
the other part of it that we've talked about in the past. That sacks are a quarterback stat. If it's one thing to 5-step drop and stand there and pat the football, it's another thing to hit your 5th step and launch one down the field to Terry McLaurin. And Jaden Daniels is going to do that, and that is one of the. I'm not going to call it a concern, but the questions that I have is do they insulate Jaden so much that they don't let him use what is his number one superpower, throwing the deep ball? But I think Kliff is going to balance that, and I think that they'll set up stuff where they have these slot fades that he can throw, and he throws as well as anybody from day one. But they're easy reads, and if it's shut down, then he knows where to go. And so there's a lot of questions for sure about this offensive line, and the fact that we still don't know who's going to start at left tackle should be said out loud to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, there is not like some stacked group. But I do think that if you're just looking at data based off last year, that data needs a ton of context. And I think you just did a really good job of providing said context.
Yeah, and I think the other thing this is a great point, and you brought this up, is the one thing Jaden Daniels, I think I slept on in the draft evaluation, but I was doing a film breakdown with Coach yesterday, and we were watching a couple plays that I picked, and he goes, the thing I love about him is he can accelerate his process immediately. So there's that play against Miami where it looks like man coverage, and they rotate to cover 2, and they're bringing in this fire zone, and he's supposed to work to the right, but he's working to the left, and he can tell right away that he screwed it up. And you're like, that would have been a sack fumble last year because he's got 2 free runners off the right side. He's looking to the left. He can't even see them. But his footwork was so good. Ball out. And it was like...
Yeah. The one that he threw out of bounds over Terry said?
Yeah. Yes. Like, I know I know he made a mistake. But the physical ability to say, oh, I did screw it up, and get my feet where I got to get him to get this ball out before the rush is even past the line of scrimmage, I thought, man, like that's going to save you 10 sacks this year, 15 sacks, like just from that physical ability of the quarterback.
For sure. And one other thing that this is kind of off topic, but that I want to circle back on, is one thing that has been impressive to me from Jaden in the preseason and in camp is his ability to extend plays and throw on the run, where last year at LSU, like often when he faced pressure, his response was to run. And he was just like, well, okay, if I can get past this dude, that's one less dude I'm going to have to run by later. Right. And he ran for a bleep ton of yards, and like it worked out all in all. Took a couple of sacks that perhaps, and maybe left some plays out there that he wouldn't if his process was different in terms of, okay, there's some pressure coming, let me escape the pocket and keep my eyes down the field. He didn't run in camp. Like he just flat out did not run, and he continually made plays off schedule in a way that was different than his process at LSU. So if that is something that he can do, and he can handle muddy pockets, which obviously you don't have to deal with in camp, and like some of the things that were questions coming out in a way that maybe he was being coached to do differently at LSU for whatever reason than he is here, and he just adapts to the coaching here and executes it at a pretty high level. Like that's a guy that, I mean, I don't think that you would have taken over Caleb necessarily number 1, but you feel somehow even better about taking him at number 2 than they did when they decided they were going to take him at number 2. Like that is a different caliber of player, and he was already good enough with what they thought he was to take him number 2 overall, and they were pretty sure that was the right move. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And again, like there's a lot of, I feel like I have to say this, there's a lot of speculation. Like these are all best case scenarios, right? Like he's shown in practice that he can do these things, and it's great. And if he continues to show that, better. If he struggles, the offensive line's going to struggle. The play caller's going to struggle. The team's going to struggle. But that's to be expected. There's going to be road bumps for a young player, right? And again, it's with the offensive line. It's a new group coming together. So we're not saying they're going to be the greatest offensive line of all time, but there is a world where Jaden looks significantly like, maybe not, again, like a top 10 player, but those developmental things you just alluded to are hit and checked off, and he looks good, and it helps the offensive line, and the offensive line is going to have their bumps in the road. But as long as the general consensus of that kind of middle of the field offense is better, then it's going to be fine. It's going to be like, they'll win 8-9 games. Great. We'll get into next year. They'll draft another offensive lineman. They'll draft a receiver, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. Like this is part of the retooling of this team and the re-identification of the organization, I think. So yeah, for sure. And you know what? They might win 6 games and it's still fine. Like we don't know, but I do think the point about the offensive line is it's generally going to be fine in a way that, we thought it would be fine last year. But then a lot of circumstances that we just talked about undid it. I think that there's just a much greater grasp of those circumstances this year and a realism that might put limits on this offense in a way that if the offensive line was more skilled, if they were actually full of 5 great players versus like 5 guys that you're scheming around to make it fine, then that does put a lower ceiling on things. But that doesn't mean that they don't understand that and will maximize whatever is possible. And by the way, on some weeks they might maximize it to the tune of 40 points, and some weekends they might not score a whole lot because it's a week-to-week league. Matchups are different. Stuff happens. That's the NFL, baby. Right.